All right, welcome to the Binary Atlas podcast. And today we are going to be talking about the history of television and all the technologies related to it for home entertainment. And today, my wife Brandi is going to be leading this conversation.
Absolutely. I've always had a really big enthusiasm for movies and television shows ever since I was a kid. And it's just a fascinating technology of how much it's changed in the last, 100 years actually, because
That's true, yeah.
Televisions were actually invented in the late 1920s. They were way too expensive for most households. They started to become a little bit more mainstream in the late 1940s and early 1950s. But the sets were huge. I mean, and I'm not saying like a huge screen like today's 80-inch, mammoth screens. I'm talking they were heavy and encased in wood most of the time.
These were decorative. They were a big piece of furniture.
They were a big piece of furniture. And these electric sets, they ran on analog circuits made of vacuum tubes.
Yes, the little whir, and it took them just a little bit to heat up.
It did. Yeah. You would have a little bit of time, waiting for that to happen. I remember at my paternal. Whoops, sorry about that. I dropped something, everyone, so you probably had a nice little blast in your ear.
I'll try to edit the thud.
Yeah. But I remember at my grandmother's house, she had a very, very old television set, probably from the 50s. And it was, like I described, a big piece of furniture. And you could see the screen. It had this greenish tint to it. Now, of course, I don't know when the screen stopped working, but you could tell around the circular area of the center of the screen, it almost looked like little rocket feet going around in a spiral where the images had kind of burned onto the screen.
Yeah.
And I mean, back in the day, a television repairman was a big job.
See, I remember. So that was the thing. They were so big and bulky that you could take off that back panel and you could literally reach every component in that TV. And like you said, because they were so expensive, TV repair shops were a huge thing.
Really everything repairable. I mean, nowadays it's like these things are disposable because you can't really fix them. But back then, your car breaks down, you take it to a mechanic. Your refrigerator breaks down, you have a mechanic come to your home. And with your television set, depending on the size of it, you might also have a repairman come to your home with a bucket full of vacuum tubes to come in and, repair that television. And at the time, the TV shows and the news programming, they ran on set schedules, and there were like the three major networks, your NBC, your ABC, and your CBS, which you may recognize from today, probably from streaming services, but they would go off air at a certain time. Many of these stations would play the national anthem like at 10 o'clock after the nightly news, and there would be nothing but a blank bullseye screen, or later on, you would see the blocks of color or the stripes of color showing that the station was offline. So, of course, those first TVs were all black and white.
Yeah.
And so, therefore, all the news shows and programming were also filmed in black and white. It was a money-saving aspect. Around the same time, movies at the movie theaters, color movies were starting to come around, but even after color started becoming more popular in the late 30s, there were still black and white movies being filmed, well into the 60s.
And is that because, if I remember correctly, the film was more expensive for them to film on?
Yes, the film and the cameras could capture the color were more expensive. Now, there was some like aftermarket editing where films could be colorized later, but it's like a bad Photoshop job. These days, you can tell if you're really looking for it, especially with today's televisions having the HD technology and things like that, it makes it, you know, a lot more noticeable. So, you've got your black and white TVs, they started becoming more popular. And then in the early TV, sorry, I can't even talk today. In the early 1950s, the technology started advancing that allowed for easier production and also cheaper production of cameras that could color, do the color film, and also televisions that could pick up those broadcasts. So you would have a color TV, but some things were still a little behind schedule, so you might still be watching some programming in black and white.
Yeah, I remember. So they would do the whole Technicolor.
Yes.
Filmed in Technicolor.
Yes, it was a
or
big
broadcast in Technicolor. I
yes,
remember that.
it was just a big deal. Also, around that same time, some of these television sets started becoming less bulky. These smaller sets were first created for traveling salesmen so that they could carry them around and demonstrate to the customers exactly what kind of television signal they could get with their standard either rabbit ear antenna, or some people back in the day would have the external antennas. You might still see some of those in older neighborhoods. I know that my late grandmother's house had the big antenna that was beside the house. And I remember a time or two her going out there and grabbing a hold of the pole and moving it around to try to get a better signal. So, your basic TV that used to be, smaller screens actually started getting bigger as far as the screens, but smaller as far as the encasing.
Yeah, so I remember when that paradigm shift got odd,
Yes.
right? Because I remember when you were still the curved glass screens, because it was still the tube TV. The TV extended, like maybe 2 or 3 feet behind it and everything, but they still got bigger.
They did.
And they would get so big, one person couldn't lift it.
Oh, no. You had to have 2 or 3 people or some kind of furniture
It was
dolly.
this really weird middle era where screens were getting bigger, yet the technology wasn't changing on the inside. Therefore, they were just getting heavier.
They were. So it wasn't quite as heavy as the old wooden furniture because TVs started having more plastic encasing them. But, you would have these all-in-one units with the plastic speakers as opposed to the fabric covered speakers of the past that were like a piece of furniture. So then, the TVs just started changing in that aspect. You started getting your plasma TVs, your LCD, your LED, and then finally into the HD TVs.
So I remember the projector TVs.
Yes.
I remember them because my cousin had one, and I had never seen one before, like a projector. It was big. I mean, it was this giant TV, but it wasn't small, right? It was a cabinet that was probably 3 or 4 feet deep, and it was tall, and it had a projector at the bottom, but the screen was this weird grayish color, and you could not see the TV unless you were looking straight at it. If you were at an angle, you couldn't see the screen.
No. And this is different than some of the projectors available today that actually project onto a screen, which is like what we have. But, the projector was inside the television, and it allowed bigger screens for a time. But like Jonathan mentioned, if you were not sitting right in front of it, you couldn't see. So that doesn't bode very well for a whole group, getting into a living room to watch a movie when, everybody who's not directly in front of it.
Yeah, I can see my cousin's dad would buy, at the time, a big sporting event like a boxing match or something like that on satellite, the giant, huge dish out in his yard, and everything, and people will come over and like split up the fee in order to watch the game.
Yes, well, and that's an excellent transition into the next topic: broadcast versus cable versus satellite. So the first TV signals, of course, were your broadcast, and they were generally your 3 major networks. and you had your public broadcasting that came later, like your PBS or AETN, but your major networks were your NBC, your ABC, and your CBS. Cable was actually available as early as 1948. I think most people are going to be shocked to hear that, but it didn't really gain popularity in the US until the late 1980s. I remember when my grandmother got cable, it was just amazing. My older teenage cousins were watching MTV, which I thought was just to die for. So, mid 80s, we were watching music videos from Bon Jovi and all the hair bands. And, they were just so cool. And my grandmother was the only one who had cable because I didn't have it at home. So it was nice getting to watch that and watch some of the Nickelodeon shows like Hey Dude and You Can't Do That on Television, things like that. It was really fun. And then kind of an overlap, satellite transmissions started in the 1970s, and they didn't actually gain a lot of popularity in households until the late 80s as well. So it's like you had some people who could get cable. It depended on where the lines were running. And in my particular area, I grew out kind of out in the country. We couldn't get cable. In fact, I don't think cable was even available in my parents' area until I graduated high school, which was the late 90s.
Yeah. I'll give you a quick little tidbit of information on the satellite stuff that I didn't know about, and I gained from someone I worked with a long time ago. So a long time ago, I worked with a guy who, during this era, worked for Hughes, like Howard Hughes, the Hughes company, right? Mm-hmm. And he was part of a team that they came in and said, hey, we have this satellite in orbit. It cost us millions upon millions of dollars. It's got all this extra bandwidth on it. Find me something we can do with that.
Ah, that's interesting.
Like how can we make more money off this satellite? And they came up with HughesNet and satellite TV.
Huh. I know. See, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So that sprung out of having the satellite in orbit that was just sitting there with all this extra bandwidth on it. They had no idea what to do with it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that allowed people like my family who were living kind of out in the country a little bit access to, I guess, some of that cable television. I remember the first satellite dish that my parents got was actually a stationary satellite dish, the huge ones. And some kids today have no concept of what these satellite televisions were like. But I mean, they're basically almost the size of a regular small car, circular, and they point into the sky. So our first satellite was stationary. It hit one satellite. So we were able to get like HBO and one MTV channel and then some random home shopping networks. And we thought it was amazing, that we could get HBO. And then later, my parents got a second satellite dish, which was the same size, but it was on a pole. And we actually had to dial in which satellite we wanted it to go to. So we would have to wait for the satellite to point to the right place. And there'd be all this fuzz on the screen during that time, and it would, hone in on the correct satellite. And there was no real good TV guide to where things were. So basically, I remember my sisters and I just mapping it one day. We just went from the very first satellite and we went to every single channel, and we kind of made us a little, TV guide of our own to see where everything was. And it was so random. I mean, you'd have like an HBO on one satellite, and then you could watch like a TBS or a Disney channel on another. And it was way out there. This was the days before you had your teeny tiny like Dish Network and DirecTV, which are still very popular today. And that's what my mother has now, just because it ended up, being better than cable. But just to backtrack a little bit, something else happened with television to make it a little bit more exciting in the early 1970s. And I know my husband's very much aware of these, but these were video game consoles. And I won't go into detail about all of these, but it's just something that you could do with your television. Because back then in the early 70s, you watched something when it came on, or you missed it. And maybe you get lucky and they'd show a rerun sometime. Otherwise, you were just out of luck. So you had these video games to occupy your time. The first one that was commercially available was actually the Magnavox Odyssey, which came out in 1972. Then the Atari, which I think is a little more popular, in 1977. The Coleco Telstar, 1977, in television, 1979. And then the next most popular one would have been the Nintendo in 1985. I know that my family never had an Atari. We did get an original 1985 version Nintendo, but we didn't have that until probably 92 or 93. We got it used from another family whose kids had outgrown it. Jonathan can probably speak a little bit more about his family's first video game system.
So mine was, so my brothers were much older than me. They were like 10 years older than me. So I don't think we had anything before they moved out. I do remember that when I was a kid, I remember in that 1985, I think I had one of the first Nintendos, and I think my grandma got it for me. Because I remember playing tons of Mario and Duck Hunt and Jaws.
Okay. Yeah, and see, all we had was Mario and Duck Hunt. We didn't have any other games that we were interested in.
I had the cart that had the Mario and the Duck Hunt on one cartridge. That came with the system.
Yeah.
I don't remember who bought me the Jaws or how I got that, but that was the only one I ever owned. All the rest of them, I always went to the movie store and rented a game for the weekend and played it and took it back.
Played it on the Nintendo.
Yeah. I remember my family, my brothers and their wives playing for hours on the thing. I remember no one wanted my dad to play Duck Hunt.
Oh, because he was probably really good at it.
Because he was so good at it that you couldn't beat him. We would make him play the full length of the cord. And because he was a really good shot, he was so good at it. So I remember those times very vividly.
Yes, well, that's something that kids today would be shocked about, that these controllers had cords. You were limited to how long the cord was to plug in these systems. But so it was just a new way of that home entertainment. Now, as far as another thing, actually taking a movie home to watch, that became more of a thing. Laser discs started being produced in the late 1970s. And so those became a little more popular in the mid 80s as far as, people renting them, because they were expensive. And so most people wouldn't have a laser disc player. Now, these laser discs, they were about the size of like your standard vinyl record, your big one, not the little 45s. And so a lot of people, when they would rent a laser disc, it would be like a small mom and pop shop, and you would rent the player as well. I never used one, but I think you did, didn't you, Jonathan?
We did. And I, of course, again, I was little, so I don't remember all of it. I would have to ask my parents about that one. But I believe Dad owned one.
Oh, and the laser disc player.
But I think, traded services for it or something to get it, because my dad was a carpenter. And my experience with it was we had a store called Renee Sims, and it was one of those all-in-one places. You went there to buy your appliances. You went there to buy your lumber and your hardware and your nails. So
like an old town, like a hardware type store.
It was a hardware type store, but they did everything, and he also had a lumber yard. So my dad was there a lot, being in construction, and then they started having this video rental space in the corner with all these laser discs. And I was a huge Superman fan, Christopher Reeve, thank you. And I had my dad rent that almost every time he took me to the store with him. And it was so funny because I remember, I was small, right? So I remember those giant stands of these buckets of nails and screws that are all slung around it in big bins. I remember that being so large and having to go past that to get to
the movies.
And I always wanted to rent Superman. My dad, to this day, probably remembers that entire movie word for word. I had them watch it so many times, but it was a big disc that you put on.
And you being the baby of the family, they had to indulge you, of course.
Of course. But yeah, so that was, I thought laser discs were awesome.
Yeah. See, I never experienced them, but I remember my first rounds through eBay when I was looking for some older movies. Some people trying to sell these old laser discs. Of course, those didn't stand a chance pretty much once video cassette recorders or VCRs came out. They actually started in the late 70s as well, based on magnetic tapes, plastic casings, and they started becoming more mainstream, although still expensive, in the mid to late 80s. There was the big battle of VHS versus Betamax. And of course, I think most people know that the reason VHS kind of won is because the adult film industry decided on VHS as their media. So it pretty much put Betamax off the map because a lot of people
think, oh, the better technology won, but that's not true. Technically, Betamax was the better technology.
It was superior.
It had better fidelity. The video looked better. It was smoother.
Less likely to get tangled up or have your machine eat the tape.
You know, it's all based in numbers, right? So if you have one set, and it doesn't matter. It's funny and ironic. It was the porn industry that did this drive, but it could have been any industry.
It could have
been. The person who's buying the most tapes,
they were the ones who won.
Dictates the winner. It's the same thing that happened to Blu-ray, right?
Yes.
Blu-ray wasn't the only technology when Blu-ray first came out. Blu-ray, there was also...
it was HD, I think.
It was called HD. I don't think it stood for high definition then. I think it was for something else. I'll have to look that up and put it in the show notes. But technically, both were really good. And how that won out is Blu-ray was backed by Sony. So Sony built in the Blu-ray player into all their drives.
Yes.
And then all of a sudden...
that became more popular.
Because you're buying a player that already has Blu-ray built in, but you got to buy this other player, so it just kind of blew.
Yeah, and that's kind of why Laserdiscs kind of fell out of fashion. Plus, Laserdiscs were subject to being scratched, whereas your VHS at the time... the tape was, for the most part, protected inside of the plastic casing. I think a lot of people learned pretty fast that you could not leave your VHS tapes inside your car when it was hot outside. And most people at the time didn't own a whole lot of VHS. They would go to the rental stores, your Blockbusters. I'm not sure how widespread Hastings was, but Hastings was here in Arkansas. And then there were the mom and pop shops. We had a little gas station that did pizza and expensive groceries, and they had a movie place that, I mean, probably they only had maybe 100 to 150 movies, but you know what? I always found something to rent.
Yep. And kids these days don't know the thrill of finding the box and looking behind it for the plastic case that had the movie in it and getting the last one.
Exactly. And that's how it was in some stores. There were other stores where you had the little circular paper disc that told you that the movie was available, and you would have to take it to the checkout, and then they would find the movie.
Yeah, we didn't have that here. Here, the stores actually have them stacked up in a row, like 2 or 3 deep, with the movie sitting in front of it.
Yes, and you were able to get it that way. Well, and in the early days of the video rentals, you could actually rent the player. I know several people did that who maybe couldn't afford a VHS player. They were able to rent the player as well and then hook it into their TV. There were some issues during that time with copyrights because you could also buy blank VHS tapes. And there were some problems people had with taping television shows to watch later. But that's what these, VCRs did.
You could copy the movies. If you had the money, you could buy a VCR player that had 2 decks.
Yes.
And you could literally hit play on one and record on the other one at the same time, and it would copy the entire movie.
It would. And later, the VHS industry started getting kind of keen on that, and they would put special seals on the tapes where you could still record it, but if you did, your picture would go from light to dark.
It was all garbled, yeah.
Well, not necessarily garbled, and I'm not not saying that I know this from experience. No. But you know, if you were, I've heard that if you were to record these, that, you know, your picture would go from light to dark constantly and different things like that. So I guess it just depended on how badly you really wanted to watch that movie. And some movies were not released for you to buy, you know, cheaply. And when I say cheaply, back then, I mean, depending on the movie, it could be anywhere from $10 to $30 for a new VHS. But some movies were only released for rental copies, and those copies that were made with a little bit better equipment, made to be played and rewound multiple times, could be upwards of $100 to $150. So I can understand some people maybe copying their favorite movies with multiple, or, you know, hooking in a VHS camcorder and maybe playing the movie on that and recording on the other. Who knows? But I guess, you know, the courts settled all that because people started, you know, people continued to tape their shows and did their movie rentals. And, you know, and then as technology tends to do, you know, there was a little bit of overlap happening again when you got your DVDs, which started becoming more popular in the 90s. You could rent them, and then you'd have your DVD players, you'd have your Blu-ray. Now, of course, I remember, I mean, I still had a VHS player well into the early 2000s.
I remember having a combo. I remember
a combo unit.
It was a DVD player and it was a VHS player.
Yes. And I mean, some people really like this vintage, I call it vintage now, vintage technology. Some of the thrift shops that I frequent actually have VHS tapes, $1 a piece. And of course, we bought a couple to make a little light that my husband made. And it was just fun. And time gone by of going and everybody showing up at the video store on Friday night, renting movies. And it was just a lot of fun. And then around that same time, actually Netflix popped up for the first time. Netflix did not start out streaming. They started out as a DVD rental, and you would rent it through the mail. Basically, you had an online platform where you would select your movies, you would make a list, and depending on your plan, you might have 1 movie out, 2 movies out, 3 movies out. I forget exactly what all the tiers were, but you would make a list of the movies that you wanted to see. And when you would get the movie, you would, you know, have as long as you wanted to watch it. And then once you sent it back and they received it, they would send you the next movie on your list.
Yeah, that was, you don't really think about it too much, but if you really were to look back on that, that was innovative.
It was.
It changed the industry. And I honestly think you probably didn't think about it back then, but that was probably the death knell of video rental places.
It started the downward spiral of what finally made those places start to go under. I mean, I think there may be like 1 Blockbuster left in the world now. I know that I just recently read an article about some of the Blockbuster video rental places. And of course, these were mostly DVDs at this point, but like in the late 2010s, I want to say it was 2016 to 2018, some of the last profitable Blockbusters were actually in Alaska. Of course, Alaska is a little more isolated, and, you know, they have those tough winters. And I would imagine that there's probably, depending on how remote the areas are, there'd be difficulty with, you know, internet services for streaming. So these DVD rental places were still a big deal for them. Also around that same time, depending on what kind of television service you have, you would have a DVR. Now you could buy a DVR, which is basically it's the digital version of the, you know, VCR, where it would have a hard drive on it and you could store shows.
We had one.
We did. I can't remember if it was through cable.
No. I bought it separate. It was its own. It was almost like buying a VCR, but it wasn't branded, so it wasn't TiVo. It didn't go with your, but your cable went into the back of it.
Okay, I vaguely recall.
And then you could set in the recorder. You could either do it live, or start recording, or you could go into the software and you could tell it what channel And from what time to what time.
That's right. That was similar to a VCR because I remember back in the day programming my VCR to record General Hospital when I was in junior high so that I could watch it when I got home.
On this one, we would program, like, let it record a bunch of TV shows.
Yes.
And then we would just watch the TV shows. And I remember, the reason I remember that unit so vividly is because it had one of the greatest features ever on it. It was called commercial skip.
Oh, yes. I remember.
So you had a button that whenever you hit it, it would automatically skip 30 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
So depending on how many commercials, you could go pop, 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 and not have to watch any commercials.
Yes. And see, I remember if you were recording on a VCR, if you were recording a show live and you were really adept at it, you could hit pause and wait until the commercial was about to end and hit pause again, and you would actually be able to record your show without commercials. I did that several times.
Yeah.
But so you had your DVRs that were unbranded, like what Jonathan was talking about, and then certain TV and satellite services, or when I say TV, I mean cable, they would come with a DVR. And once that happened, it really started changing that service because you no longer had to set a certain time. You went onto your screen on your TV and you were able to actually select what shows you wanted, and you could set up a recurring, thing. And what helped with that was if you had some sort of, especially if you're on a network and let's say there was a presidential State of the Union or something that ran long, if you just had a certain time set, you may end up missing your show. But with these new technology DVRs, they knew when the show started late and it would still record it for you.
Auto-magically.
Yes, it was amazing. So after that point was when the internet-based streaming started. Netflix.
They saw the way the wind was blowing.
They
and
did.
Was ready.
Something that was only a fantasy to me when I was younger. I remember my sisters, my friends, and I talking about it of, oh, wouldn't it be so cool if you could just go and just choose what you wanted to watch anytime you wanted to watch it. We thought it was just, fantasy speaking, that it would never happen. But then it did. Netflix, Amazon, Disney Plus, Hulu, and then pretty much all major and minor networks now have a streaming service. I remember at first it was just kind of a secondary thing. Like, if I'd missed my show, I could watch it like the next day on the network. Some of the networks now require you to have some sort of a cable or satellite provider to sign in. Other places make you pay a monthly subscription or a yearly subscription fee. The first one we ever used was Netflix, and we still have Netflix. We have several because we don't have cable or satellite.
I would say probably the most used is Disney Plus by our kids.
Well, and Netflix with our daughter.
Yeah,
she
really loves those services. I tend to spend actually most of my time on Amazon and Paramount Plus.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a sci-fi fan and a lot of Star Trek stuff. All the old Star Treks came out, so I sometimes when I need something to watch where I'm just wanting to veg, I don't really want to have to pay attention too hard. I've seen it before. I like going to Paramount and watching some of those old shows on there.
Yes, and see, I enjoy Hulu because with us not having a network broadcast, I like to watch a couple of shows, and some of the originals on Hulu are really good. So I tend to use that one more. But that's our main entertainment. We don't have cable. We don't have a satellite. So we can justify the expense of that. And then I know some people still want to, they may pause their services and just subscribe to one at a time, which is a great money-saving feature. A lot of local libraries will still rent DVDs. I know recently our daughter wanted to watch Titanic, which it wasn't available on any of the streaming services. I didn't want to pay to rent it or anything. So I hit up my local library, and luckily they had the DVD, and I was able to break out my old DVD player and play that movie for her. So at this point, with so many people streaming, I mean, it's 2023. DVD sales, they are waning. You can still purchase things on DVD, but they are not under production as much as they were before. In fact, some of them are probably not even being stamped until people order them.
You've got movies that are doing a simultaneous release in theaters and on HBO Max.
Or just a couple of weeks later, I know that there have been a couple, like our daughter wanted to see a horror movie. Her first one, I was so proud. So I took her to the theater to see it, just as a fun mother-daughter thing. But then like 2 to 3 weeks later, it was available. I can't remember which one it was on, Peacock or Paramount Plus, but it was available there. And honestly, I see theaters not being as big very soon. I mean, it's already starting with COVID. When that happened, I think that changed the face of a lot of the things with the theater. So home entertainment is becoming a lot more prevalent.
Or the theaters are going to have to up their game.
They are.
Right, because I do like the theater experience.
Oh, I do too.
But at the same time, I don't like the theater experience.
Uh-huh.
Right, because most of these places you go to, they're not well maintained. They're not clean. The bathrooms are horrid.
Oh, yeah.
The food's overly priced.
Oh, I can speak to that. A couple of weekends ago, I took our daughter to see Are You There, God, It's Me, Margaret, which was fabulous, by the way. If you have a young girl in your life, take her to see that. It was wonderful. But it was almost $40. And this is matinee, right? My daughter and I went to the matinee. We both got a bottle of water and a small popcorn, and it was almost $40.
Yeah.
So that's I mean, that'll almost pay for one of these yearly subscriptions to one of these streaming services.
I mean, so you've got, technologies get, like you said earlier, technology get better. Projectors are getting cheaper. We've got a projection screen in RMA Entertainment Space, 120-inch screen, really nice surround sound
really
system.
Really nice.
So in order to get me to go to a theater, I have to either A, really want to watch that movie in the large screen theater experience, or two, if I go and I pay that much money, I want a luxury experience, not
your standard,
your standard crap that you deal with. If you know what the theater smell is, that shouldn't be a thing.
No, it shouldn't be. It's, a mixture of urine and stale popcorn, kind of is what it smells like.
Yeah.
But, it is what it is. I mean, that used to be a big thing for me when I was a kid, both video rentals and going to the theater on occasion. So, things are changing. It's 2023. It's almost impossible now to purchase a VHS player. You could still find one working in a thrift store, maybe. DVDs and VHS are very commonly found in thrift stores. But I often wonder, will there be a retro revival like there was with vinyl for music? I mean, maybe.
So maybe my 2 cents on that is most of the time when you hear people talk about vinyl, CD, it always comes down to, converting it to digital really takes away some of the fidelity of the music, and vinyl is more akin to listening to it live. And you have these audiophiles debating back and forth, right? But I don't see that same thing happening for video.
But, it's the nostalgia factor. So, I mean, what do y'all think? Let us know in the comments. What do you think? What was your favorite memory of these times? Did you really enjoy that Laserdisc player, or was a DVD your jam? Let us know. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, we would. And as always, you can get a hold of us at binaryatlas.com, where we will be posting the show notes. There will be a link down below where you can go directly to the show notes and leave a comment. If you'd like, we would love to respond and talk with you about that. Also, remember, we have our YouTube channel, Binary Atlas. So if you go to youtube.com/@binaryatlas, you'll find that. And then, of course, we are on all the social media networks. Just look up Binary Atlas, and we'll be glad to talk to you about this kind of stuff there as well.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Have a good day, guys.